and I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Alaji Dr. Mahamadou Bawumia, Vice President of Ghana. Mr. Vice President, you have the floor.
Thank you. I thank the President of the Council for the month of January 2022, His Excellency Jonas Gahr Store, Prime Minister of Norway, for convening this high-level open debate on the topic war in cities, protection of civilians in urban settings. I convey to you, Mr. President, and the Council, President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo's best wishes for a successful debate. I also join other speakers in thanking the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, and the other briefers for their useful insights on the topic of this high-level open debate. Mr. President, the asymmetrical nature of the prevailing wars in the cities and the consequent embedding of combatants within the interconnected resources and infrastructure of urban areas poses immense challenges for the protection of civilian populations. Advancements in science and technology have led to the development of compact and more sophisticated weapon systems that are able to deliver greater damage to targets and their surroundings. The humanitarian consequences of the increasing urbanized conflicts on civilian populations are therefore serious and require careful consideration of existing frameworks for the management of urban wars. We therefore welcome the focus that this debate brings to this topic. Wars by nature exact untold suffering, death, and destruction. However, when wars are fought in cities, their impact on populations is even worse. They lead to higher incidence of mortality, destruction of critical life support infrastructure like hospitals, greater numbers of internally displaced persons, and a higher incidence of criminal and sexual exploitation, particularly once such wars are prolonged. This creates further vulnerabilities that are exploited by violent extremist groups to radicalize young people. 2018 data from the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs shows that the world is becoming increasingly urbanized, with 55% of the world's population living in urban areas and a rise to 68% expected by 2050. Asia and Africa, where most stabilization efforts are taking place, are expected to be the fastest areas of urbanization. The outbreak of conflicts would therefore have telling effects in view of the population densities of those two continents. Already, we have seen in recent years evidence of horrific effects of urban conflicts in places like Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, but also much earlier on the African continent in countries such as Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Cote d'Ivoire, where civil wars that took place had an adverse impact in the city context. Mr. President, the rise of terror and violent extremist groups and organizations such as Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Al-Shabaab, and ISIS have revealed the huge threat posed to civilian lives. Such groups do not fight in accordance with the rules of war. They scapegoat civilians in their crusades and consider them as cannon fodder. The roles played by civilians in such wars also demonstrate the conflicting, nuanced, and complex nature of modern warfare. The Geneva Conventions and additional protocols, which are at the core of international humanitarian law, as well as the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2175, provide for the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. Indeed, although attempts have been made to bind state actors and armed groups to the rules of war, much of the conflict we experience globally and in the continent of Africa continues to involve civilian combatants and often result in scapegoating of the civilian populations. They have been used as human shields by warring sides or have become victims of heinous crimes. Mr. President, the devastating impact of urban wars on civilian populations, more investments need to be put into devising the needed coping mechanisms and adaptation tools in tackling the issue. I would therefore highlight the following points for consideration of the Council. First, we need to enhance global norms and standards on civilian protection in urban conflicts by prioritizing the integration of civilian protection in the planning and conduct of military operations. The Council can play a useful role by encouraging national authorities to embrace useful initiatives for the re-education and retraining of combatants on the new landscape of war, an acknowledgement of the redefinition of who the enemy is, and a calibration of the acceptable tactics employed in contemporary warfare to assure the safety of the civilian populations. Secondly, the bane of any global norm lies in the lack of effective enforcement. We must therefore develop strong accountability frameworks which place the protection of civilians in armed conflicts at the heart of national and international justice systems. This requires states to recommit to international humanitarian law in their conduct of warfare and for zero tolerance of the impunity of non-state actors. Thirdly, while a general and complete cessation of all urban wars is an ideal aspiration, war reality requires that we focus towards assessing and developing the resilience of existing urban infrastructure to cope with wars, particularly in terms of evacuation efforts, shelter zones, and alternate life-supporting infrastructure. These need to be complemented by the retention of support systems that psychologically equip civilians with the right tools, knowledge, and skills required to build faster to recover as much of their lives as possible after wars ravage their lands. Fourthly, I urge that we act to control the nature of an indiscriminate use of explosives in war, combined with the management of the high civilian population density of urban areas to reduce the adverse impact that often leads to the loss of lives, crucial infrastructure such as schools and hospitals, and sources of livelihood such as business centers in these areas. Mr. President, we must recognize that in developing norms and standards to protect civilian populations during conflict, there is a strong need for local engagement in order to assure the acceptance of such norms. Local communities need to be empowered in order to take required preventative actions and also in order not to shield perpetrators of crimes against civilian populations. Also, in addressing the resilience of urban communities, the issue of poverty, which is an important element in urbanization, would need to be taken cognizance of and addressed. National initiatives would therefore need to be supported to equalize access to economic opportunities in all parts of a country, develop alternate and reinforcing urban communities, and manage the push and pull factors of migration that sometimes lead to unplanned urbanization outcomes and which sometimes create fodder for the intensification of such conflicts. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank His Excellency Dr. Bawumia for his statement.